Well, here we are at the Saltwater Sportsman National Seminar Series presented by Sperry Topsider after a very successful seminar in Savannah, Georgia. I'm sitting right next to Captain Rob Ferris, who is not only an ardent king mackerel tournament angler, but also an inshore angler who pursues redfish and trout. Rob, as you mentioned to me, you said you were coming back down here to Savannah, Georgia to enter a redfish tournament in March. Is that correct?
That's correct. I believe the 12th of March.
Okay, you're out of Charlotte, North Carolina originally, but you fished the Carolina coast as well as the Georgia coast and some of the Gulf of Mexico states. When you're coming in from out of town, in a case like Savannah, what's going to determine where you're going to start to fish to try to get your biggest score in terms of redfish?
Well, you know, it depends on the time of year, George. Obviously, the fish are going to be in certain times of the year, and this time of the year, or in March, they're still going to be schooled up a little bit, and they're going to be pretty tight to some structure, and so we're going to try to find some in the creeks and bays, and we'll come down a couple weeks in advance and also scout the areas out, just try to locate some fish.
All right, so you're talking in March. You said they're mostly still way back in a lot of these creeks at that time frame.
Yeah, they're pretty tight in some creeks, trying to stay away from predators. Also trying to still stay warm and still find some foraging bait that kind of hangs out in the grass marsh during the winters.
All right, and what comes into play as far as telling you, well, I'm going to work up in this set creek over here, or maybe I'm going to run down 3 or 4 miles to another set? What's the right characteristics that come into play that tell you exactly where to go and look for these fish? There has to be certain conditions.
There are. I like clean water, and if we can make sure there's clean water around, it helps us spot the fish. Also, we're looking for concentration of bait fish, or some sort of crustacean that they could be feeding on. So we're kind of moving down the banks, and a lot of times we'll actually intentionally try to spook some fish just so we kind of know where they are.
And just by running a boat along and see if you see big wakes and blow them out of a zone.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now how important or critical is it in terms of the tide when you're looking for these fish back up in the creeks too? Is this more of a high tide situation or a low tide? Give me an idea of how tide's going to factor where you're looking for these fish.
Well, tide's definitely a big factor, especially in this area. There's a big, large tide. It's 8-9 feet at some times of the year. So, you know, the biggest thing I'm concerned about with the tide is, you know, if there's no water or it's low tide, they're going to be in the troughs and in the deep parts of the creeks, obviously. They've got to be there. They're not going to move far from their foraging area. You know, when it's flood high tide or whether they're going to try to get up into the grass areas, close into the grass as they can, to try to forage on some bait. So the tides are a big deal. Number one is you don't want to get stuck back in some of these creeks because, you know, 6 hours later you might be able to come back out.
Exactly. Now, when you're in a tournament, I'm guessing it's all strictly artificial. No live bait is allowed. Am I correct on that?
That's correct. Yes.
All right. So what's going to be maybe one of your go-to baits when you're fishing the redfish, like you said you are in March?
In March, I'm going to probably stick with something fairly small, something light. Because the bait's typically still small that time of year. So
what are you defining as small? Are we talking about a grub? Are we talking topwater lure, a swimming bait? What?
I'm talking about a grub or something along like a jerkbait style lure, but actually something in between 1 and 3 inches.
Okay.
Something really small, and sometimes we'll downsize the hook. Just because if you look, the mud minnows at that time of year are real small. Everything they're eating is typically small because it's cold. The larger predator or the larger baits have not moved back into these areas yet, so they're foraging on the small things that are here year round.
All right. Any particular color?
Actually, I do like like the black and silver metal flakes that time of year around here, and also a gold metal flake, but something in the darker colors.
All right, now take me through the subtleties of actually working that little jerk bait that you're talking about.
Well, primarily we try to sight fish for them, and you know, if we can sight fish for them, we're going to try to present that bait and just get a little bit past them and slide it into them very carefully and just let them, you know, because again, they're going to be feeding slower than normal, but they will take a bait, and we're just going to try to finesse them to grab that lure.
Okay, if you had to boil it down, and again, focusing on March and the area being Savannah, and you're coming back in for the tournament, if you had to boil it down to 3 critical things that you're going to be looking for that you feel could help you win that tournament, what would be the 3 most critical factors that have to come into play to make you win this?
Well, I'd like to just try to get up in the creeks where I know that the fish are staging. Yeah. And I've really got to find those creeks, and we'll probably spend a lot of time just looking for fish that are still schooled up, where they're kind of hanging out in the hole or on a mud flat during the day, and then they're kind of moving into the grasses, and they're still trying to stay away from predators that time of year. So they'll still be congregated up, and then they'll try to warm up. So I'm going to be looking for a congregation of fish, because we have a slot limit in these tournaments, and we're trying to bump that higher end slot limit with 2 fish. So we want to be able to try to target a lot of fish to be able to weed through them and get those 2 perfect fish.
Understood. So you sit there and you basically cull them out and go with your 2 top of the line slot fish that are going to help you weight wise get in there.
The most weight you can get and stay in their slot limit as far as the length.
Understood. That is Captain Rob Ferris from the Saltwater Sportsman National Seminar Series in Savannah.